So welcome back to Rad TV, and we've got Henshall with us today, and he's going to be talking about tax evasion and the extent of it, really.
Well, we've had some astonishing figures about the extent of tax evasion and the hidden wealth of the super rich. And perhaps as interesting as the numbers is where it comes from. They've been pulled together by the Tax Justice Network, which are a campaigning network. So, some people would say, oh, well, they're biased, they've got an axe to grind. But just look at who's collated their figures. James Henry, former chief economist at consultancy McKinsey and an expert on tax havens. So in other words, they've got one of the poachers in, as a gamekeeper. Right. And he's based his figures largely on official world, World Bank, etc. type figures. So this isn't just a bunch of angry people who've made it all up or anything. And what he's saying is that they're hiding $13 trillion of wealth offshore, which is as much as the American and Japanese GDP put together. So a whole year of America and Japan together, all their production over one whole year is basically how much the super rich have managed to hide and evade the taxes on.
Well, that's also the national debt, isn't it, more or less? The American national debt's just gone over 16.7 trillion, hasn't it?
Well, there we are. Yeah. So you could pay off the whole of the American national debt if you could somehow find this money, which is mostly quite likely completely illegal money. It's not just sort of a tax avoidance. They make a distinction between tax avoidance and tax evasion. But if the money's from a drug deal, then it's tax evasion as far as most people are concerned, even if they might have avoided it technically.
Well, if it hasn't gone through the corporation's books, then it's by definition illegal, really, isn't it?
But of course a lot of this money has gone through the books and it is quite legally tax avoidance. The point being that the laws are all wrong, and the G20 are saying that they want to change the laws, but nothing much has happened yet.
Well, they've been saying they want to change the laws for a long time now, haven't they? But why haven't they?
That's right. Well, we can come to that in a minute. But according to James Henry, the top 10 private banks are the people who are mostly doing the dirty here. UBS, Credit Suisse, and Goldman Sachs, our old friends, Goldman Sachs.
The usual suspects.
And these top 10 private banks, because they are private, apparently Goldman Sachs, managed more than 4 trillion of personal assets in 2010, which was up from 1.5 trillion 5 years earlier. So since the financial crisis, when everybody started talking about the banks and the rich, actually it's got a lot worse. So the talk has not been matched by any action at all yet, at least. And the cumulative value of the capital that's flown out of the poorer economies since the 70s, when privatization first started to come in, would be more than enough to pay off all their debts, which at the moment they get taxed on.
So we're giving a few million in aid, which
is really just helping them pay the interest.
Our populations are complaining about anyway, and yet the West is taking just
vast amounts. Well, not the West. That's the problem. It's not, and that's in a sense why the population here is complaining, because they don't see any of this. This goes straight to the super rich with their offshore tax havens. And here the figures are: 500 billion has left Russia since the fall of communism in the early 90s. Saudi Arabia has seen 197 billion coming out since the mid-70s. Nigeria, 196 billion. And of course, what the report points out is they say the assets of these countries are held by a small number of wealthy individuals, while the debts of the countries are shouldered by the ordinary people of the country through their governments.
Well, we see that in this country, don't we? Where the debts of the banks are socialised, and
that's right. It's
the debts of the nation are privatised.
Social security for the rich, and the size of the tax pile is now grossly affecting the statistics on inequality. So although inequality is bad enough as it is anyway, we know that, but that's been calculated by and large without taking into effect the missing 13 trillion. And what Henry's calculated is that 6 trillion of assets is owned by 92,000 people out of the world's population. 0.001% of the world's population are holding 6.3 trillion of assets. And that tiny class of mega rich have got more in common with each other than those at the bottom of the income scale have. Yeah. And of course that's another interesting point, because some people say, you shouldn't speculate, and maybe there isn't a global oligarchy. Well, this is it, that there is a global oligarchy, and it's
and this is their bank account,
and they've got more in common with each other than they have with anybody else. David Cameron, George Osborne, Barack Obama, they're in that 92,000. And they, according, the judgment of these guys is that these guys know they have got more in common with all the rest of us, and they know it. And so, we're in a pretty precarious situation. A staggering failure. Inequality is much, much worse than official statistics show. That's what they're saying in this report.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. Can I just put that, because people have, it's very difficult for people to actually visualize what a trillion is.
Yes, it is difficult, yeah.
Some figures which I've checked out and I know are true. If you take a million seconds is 12 days.
Right.
If you take a trillion seconds...
A billion seconds.
Sorry, a billion seconds. A billion seconds is 32 years, and a trillion seconds is 32,000 years.
Wow. So if you have a second as being a pound,
yeah,
it's like 32,000 years worth
to get a trillion pounds, you'd have to count one number a second for 32,000 years.
Yeah. So we're talking, to translate it back in, I guess 13 trillion is 13,000 billion.
Yeah.
It is pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
And now you were mentioning earlier, why hasn't the G20 managed to achieve anything? Well, of course, we've partly answered it. So long as David Cameron and Barack Obama are in charge, they perhaps it never will. But Cameron came up with some very worthy comments recently. He seems to know exactly what needs to be done, but as with Barack Obama, the problem is they seem to do the opposite. After they make their public announcement, which sounds great, and then they go off and quietly do the opposite.
Well, I wonder if they are in this 92,000 people really in. I mean, certainly Gordon Brown wasn't. I don't think Gordon Brown was part of the 92,000.
Well, Gordon Brown was, to his credit, and I was never a big supporter of Gordon Brown, but he did say that there was no need for cuts, and at that point his financial secretary, Alistair Darling, ratted on him and made his position pretty much untenable, and he had to agree to cuts, but there was no need for it. And a similar thing happened in Greece. They were going to call a referendum which would have led to a rejection of the EU austerity, and the finance minister ratted on the prime minister. So these finance ministers, they rub shoulders with the super rich, and well, now we get on to the next point, because of course you can't prove this, but the suspicion is that somehow money ends up in their own personal pockets through the process of lobbying, which is a sort of, can be just a euphemism for bribery and corruption. And who better to know about that than Jack Abramoff? Now, here in the UK, we're not that familiar with Jack Abramoff, but it was a huge scandal in the States. One of Washington's top lobbyists was caught and sent to jail, and now he's become another poacher turned gamekeeper. And he says that while 95% of lobbyists are honest, quotes, the problem is when you're one of the unethical lobbyists, you'll be able to crush the others. In other words, half the lobbyists, or 95%, he says optimistically, are honestly trying to convince people with arguments, while in the evening, over a drink, the 5% are trying to convince people with cash, and cash talks more than arguments if you're an American politician. And what are the solutions? Abramoff, is probably in quite a good position to know. And what's he saying? He's brought out a book called Capitol Punishment, The Hard Truth About Corruption. It was published in November 2011. He's also been featured in a couple of films, one with Kevin Spacey. I think that's a sort of semi-fictitious film called Casino Jack. I bet it's a good film to watch. And of course it didn't get much publicity. Mainstream media aren't very good at publicising things which are damaging to the elite.
Sure, yeah.
I personally never listen to film reviews or TV reviews for that reason. But he's calling for, here's Abramoff's 3-point plan. Tight limit on political contributions, nothing more than $500 to a political party. Much wider definition of lobbying, so that people who are actually lobbyists, research foundations, maybe even TV moguls like Rupert Murdoch, who use their political power to make money out of and get the laws changed. And no jobs for politicians in industries that they've regulated for 10 years after they retire. That might really fix it.
Yeah.
It would certainly
Stop the revolving door.
Stop the revolving door.
Yeah.
So there we are. That's how it could be done. Yeah. And we can only hope that one day somebody will force the politicians to do it.
Yeah, that's what they're supposed to be for. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. That was the final section of this edition of Rad TV. See you soon.